All right, good evening, First Baptist Church. How y'all doing this evening? Woo, that was exciting. All right, if you would stand, we're going to worship. We're going to do When the Roll is Called Up Yonder. And I know y'all know this song, and during practice, we sang it through, and I felt like it was a little slow, so I had him speed it up. And then Wendy had to go in the office, and she had to do a breathing treatment. So if it's a little fast, it's my fault. Keith kept up. Yeah, come on. Do it. Come on. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, when the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll seated.
Amen. Thank you, team. Good evening. How's everybody tonight? We're so glad you're here. If you're watching online, thanks for joining with us. I love Wednesday nights. We're in a study of Leviticus, and every week when I think it can't get any more shocking, I read the next chapter and have to evaluate how I'm gonna study that. And so tonight is no exception. It's a page turner of a chapter. And so we're going to look at this beginning in Leviticus chapter 17, if you'll turn to chapter 17. And what I'm going to do, we're going to look at chapter 18 and 19 mostly tonight, but I want to begin with chapter 17. And in fact, I'm just going to give you a summary here. Leviticus chapter 17 shares prohibitions concerning where a sacrifice can be made, that is, only at the tabernacle. Apparently, some of them were taking goats out and they were sacrificing the goats out in the fields. And there are two problems with that. Number one, a priest isn't involved, obviously, because priests are at the tabernacle. There are no priests out in the fields. And so they're really acting as their own priests. And it turns out some of them were sacrificing the goats to a goat god rather than God. And so just to make things clear, if you're going to make a sacrifice, animal sacrifice, it needs to be at the tabernacle or eventually the temple. And so it also discusses blood and prohibitions about coming into contact with blood from an animal you might kill or eat that is not involved in any sacrifice. If you're out in the field and you're going to dress an animal, kill an animal and dress it, what do? You have to actually bleed it out and bury the blood. You can't eat any of the blood. You can't cook it. You can't drink it, anything like that. So any of you who have ever eaten any kind of dish that had blood in it, we're not from England, but whatever, that kind of dish, that was a no-no. That's not allowed. And so there's more talk about that, and we have already looked at those kinds of discussions in Leviticus, and that's why I'm not going to go through that in detail. Basically, you can't eat or drink any blood. You have to bury the blood whenever you clean the animal, wherever you are. Now, we'll go to Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18, verse 1, if you'll turn there with me. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the man who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She's your mother. Do not have sexual relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father." Now let me stop right there and I tell you that last week we came to a chapter, and I didn't read the chapter. I told you it was so not so awful. It's God's word. Graphic, maybe I should say. Shocking, that I said, I'm not going to study this chapter. I'll let you read that on your own. And it's one of those, you can just read it for yourself. I didn't realize at the time, and I told you the chapter, I mentioned the chapter number, but I later received confessions from some of the congregation, particularly my staff, that said as soon as I said that, instead of listening to the rest of my lesson, they immediately read that chapter. So I was going to skip this chapter tonight because it talks a lot about sexual relations, but I realized if I skip it, you're just going to sit there and read it, so we're going to look at it. Secondly, I find this interesting. I'm going to summarize a little bit, but he begins this discussion about who you should not sleep with. Now, again, I would think, I'm assuming you would think the same thing, that there is some common sense involved in knowing who not to sleep with. But God understands that God bless them. Some folks have more common sense than other folks, and some people just need to have very clear boundaries. So we're going to talk about what kind of persons and species you can and cannot have a physical relationship with now. And so I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize here in a moment, but he begins this section by saying, verse 7, don't dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She's your mother, do not have relations with her. Now, what I find interesting is that he doesn't discuss the DNA problem or the problem with chromosomes or genes because you're all in the same family or anything like that. What he does say as the reason why you shouldn't sleep with your mother, he says, it's your mom. That's why. I'm shocked that anybody would read this and go, oh, I guess that makes sense now. Thanks for telling me. And so here's the short version of all of the verses that follow. Don't sleep with your mom, your stepmom, your sister, your stepsister, your granddaughter, your aunt, your daughter-in-law, your sister-in-law, or sister-in-law, unless your wife is dead and she isn't married, in which case you can marry your sister-in-law. And don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, which is basically means don't touch anyone anywhere that isn't your spouse. So I think that the general synopsis of this is family reunions are not a good place to go meet people for your next spouse. And then secondly, he says don't touch your neighbor's wife. And so that's anybody that's not in your family that's already married. So you don't sleep with people you know and with people you don't know, all right? Unless it's your spouse. All right, now look in verse 21. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Now he's going to get back to the don't sleep with discussion in just a minute. Right in the middle of it, though, he puts this prohibition right here. I don't know if it's already a problem or God knows that it's going to be a problem. But before I look at Molech, I do remind you of how he begins this whole section. He says, I don't want you to behave the way that the Egyptians behave. That's where they came. That's their culture. That's what they know. And again, you can take the people out of Egypt, but it's a lot harder to take Egypt out of the people. Because that's their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents. They all grew up in Egypt. Egypt is all they knew. Egypt, theology and culture and a lot of bad things in Egypt, and all those bad things they took with them out into the wilderness, or those bad tendencies. And so God is again reminding them in the midst of these discussions about relationships, et cetera, and false gods, hey, you're not Egyptians. Don't behave like Egyptians. Paul had the same challenge with Gentiles because Gentiles were basically Romans who converted to Christianity rather than the Jews who converted to Christianity. So the Jews had some context because they had the Old Testament. They understood the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They understood the concept of right and wrong from the Ten Commandments and the law that we have in Leviticus. But the Romans didn't get any of that. The Greeks didn't get any of that. They had, if you do a history lesson of Greek and Roman morality, you'll be horrified. It's not any better than the Egyptians were. And so they did things that would just horrify us today. And so he has to remind them, don't be like the Egyptians. But then he says, you're headed for a place that has gods, the land of Canaan, and the gods of the Canaanites. He says, I don't want you to do what you did in Egypt or what the Egyptians do, but when you get to this new place, I don't want you to do what they do either. Just warning them ahead of time. Now, having said that, he then says, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Now, Molech was was a god. As with many details in ancient history, the exact origin of Moloch, it's Moloch or Molech, here it's Molech in my translation, or Moloch. Worship is unclear as exactly what transpired, but we do know that one of the things that transpired was they gave their child, sacrificed their child as a human sacrifice. The term Moloch is believed to have originated with the Phoenician MLK, Moloch, which referred to a type of sacrifice made to confirm or quit a vow. The Phoenicians were a loosely gathered group of people who inhabited Canaan, that is modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, between 1550 BC and 300 BC, right in the context of the Israelites coming into the Promised Land. In addition to sexual rituals, Moloch worship included child sacrifice or passing children through the fire. It is believed that idols of Moloch were giant metal statues of a man with a bull's head. Each image had a hole in the abdomen and possibly outstretched forearms that made a kind of a ramp to the hole. A fire was lit in and around the statue. Babies were placed on the statue's arms or in the hole. When a couple sacrificed their firstborn, they believed that Moloch would ensure financial prosperity for the family and future children. Wow. I don't know what your financial plan is, but good grief. So here, no, we don't know exactly, but here are some depictions of Moloch. Okay, now you see the outstretched arms and the oven there, and then the little oven there, and you put the kid in there. And this actually is a recreation. There's no hole in his abdomen, but this is a recreation of Moloch or Molech that was on display. And you see there's somebody lounging in a lounge chair in front of them. You see that? Apparently it was in a lobby area at the Great Colosseum in Rome. And for whatever reason, they had this thing about Carthage and the battle between Romans and Carthage. And as a part of the display, they had Moloch there right in front of the lounge chairs. But, of course, that doesn't look like a bull to me. That, of course, looks like the creature from the Black Lagoon to me, more than Molech. But anyway, that's what it is, and that's what they did. And so what was the purpose of them sacrificing their child? For financial gain, better prosperity. Now, in our culture, we have, for example, abortion. And abortion happens, not always, but many times because of financial concerns. The parent feels that they can't afford the child. Now, they're not sacrificing it to a god, but there is a financial connection to that sacrifice, and the amount of abortions that we have add up to far more than was ever sacrificed to Molech, as far as we know. But it's odd that people would do that, and I again assure you, if the world is still here in 2,000 years, our future generations will look back at us and they will think the same thing that we think. How could they do that? But that's what they did. Molech or Moloch worship wasn't limited to Canaan. And I found this, I got this from a commentary. I found this very interesting. Monoliths in North Africa also bear the name or the engraving of MLK, Moloch, often written MLK, MR, et cetera, et cetera. In North Africa, Moloch was renamed Kronos. Kronos migrated to Carthage in Greece, and that's why they have this on display, because of the Carthage connection. And his mythology grew it to include his becoming a Titan and the father of Zeus. Moloch is affiliated with and sometimes equated to Baal, although the word Baal also used to designate various gods or rulers in Canaan. So I say that to say Molech evolved, his mythology evolved to who? To Kronos, which is a Greek god that was the father of Zeus. Isn't that interesting? I just found that I didn't know that. A little bit of false god trivia for you there. All right, verse 22. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. And again, these are common sense rules, you would think. I'm speculating that God would say, I would think, I wouldn't have to tell everybody this, but apparently he does. Verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. So I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the aliens living among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Now let me say this. What he's telling them, in fact, he says it twice just in this passage alone, you can't do these things because the people in the land that you're about to take over did these things, and this is why I'm judging them. That is, God's judgment came upon a nation for no other reason except, there are two things that he mentions here, sexual immorality and idolatry. Those two things alone were sufficient for him to overthrow and end those kingdoms and those nations. So what I find interesting about this is these sexual deviations are unfortunately fairly commonplace in our culture. In fact, I don't know about the one about your mom. I didn't look that up. But I do know that one of the few laws that we still have is with animals. You can't do that because they say it's against the rights of the animal or something like that. And so that's still illegal. That's about the only sexual law that we have left in our nation. And because we've now whittled it down to one, or two, children and animals. Those are your only prohibitions in this culture anymore. And when those go, there's nothing left. And so we, in all of our advancements in the 21st century, find ourselves at the precipice of living the lives that the Canaanites lived when God judged them. I don't want to sound like an old fire and brimstone preacher, but I have to notice here that God gives his reasons for destroying these nations, and his reasons had to do with sexuality and idolatry. So, verse 29. Is it verse 29? Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from other people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am your God. I'm the Lord your God. Now, to be fair to them, this is not easy for them. Now, you and I would think it would be easy, that they're all thinking, yeah, of course, I would never do that. They came from a culture where it was commonplace. And so we have people come into the church that grow up in our culture, our secular culture, our liberal culture, and they come into the church and they find out they're not supposed to do some of these things, and they struggle with that. And you may have be somebody that came from that culture, and you're going, wow, I'm not supposed to do that. And so, because it's a very different culture here, and so you would think that they would just go, oh yeah, of course I would never do any of that. But they're not thinking that because that's the culture that they came from. And God knows it's a struggle for them simply because it's been ingrained in them all of their life as acceptable behavior. In the Middle East, there are behaviors that you and I find shocking and horrific and immoral, and we just can't conceive of how they could possibly do that. And they, in turn, look at our morality and they are shocked and horrified, and they can't conceive of how we could possibly do that in our culture. And so there's this ingraining of culture. And against that, there's God and what God says, And what God says matters the most because God is the one who created sexuality. He knows why he made it and what its function and purpose is and what is the healthy and best path for you and I. So there. Now, I want to read a little article from a theologian in, well, did I write it down? Yes, I did. This is the Bible Exposition Commentary. He says this: we live in a sex-saturated society. It smiles at monogamous marriages, encourages abortion as a means of birth control, promotes and endorses kinky sex as a means of entertainment, claims that moral absolutes don't exist, and really believes that people can violate moral standards and escape the consequences. And then he says Fulton J. Sheen was right when he said, quote, the Victorians pretended sex did not exist. The moderns pretend that nothing else exists. That is, we live in a sex-crazed society. I could give you statistics, but you probably already have an idea of how prevalent it is in our world. And then he has a word about authority. He says, these are several reasons why God gives clear instructions concerning personal sexual hygiene, sexual morality, and marriage. For one thing, we're created in the image of God, and the Creator knows what is best for His creation. God certainly wants married couples to enjoy the beautiful gift of sex, but He also wants them to avoid the terrible consequences that come when His laws are violated. And now I've said this before, if in a single generation, this world simply obeyed collectively the requirements of God for sexuality, in a single generation, there would be no rape, there would be no incest, there would be no sexually transmitted diseases. They would all be choked out in a single generation. There would be no fatalities and deaths because of these terrible diseases. There would be no prostitution. You can go on and on and on with the list. That is, God doesn't write these things against us or to judge us. He cares about us. He wants to keep us safe like any parent would with their children. And so that's why, as a parent, I don't care whether you're hyper-conservative, moderate, or liberal, you don't want your children growing up in broken relationships and with lots of diseases and dying of a terrible disease of some kind. Nobody wants that for their children. And so we try to put boundaries on our children as they grow into teenage years and hope that they learn to make good decisions that are safe and that will build healthy relationships for them. And that's exactly what God is trying to do here. There's great wisdom in what He's saying. So don't think of this as mean old rules from God just to be a joy killer. On the contrary, God wants us to enjoy our relationships in a healthy manner and a long life. Okay? And then he also says God had chosen Israel to be the channel through which His Son would come into the world. And it was important that the channel be sanctified. The breakdown of marriage in the Jewish society and the adopting of pagan practices could threaten the plan of God for their redemption. And so he says that. Are there any comments or questions about that chapter before we move on to chapter 19? I knew we'd get through that pretty quick as I could, and so have some time. So we're going to look at chapter 19. I'm going to begin in verse 9. If you would look there, chapter 19, verse 9. And I only skipped some things just because we've already covered them. Leviticus 19:9. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Now I like this because immediately God, not the government, God is telling them, you need to be thinking about the poor and the needy. Now, also notice that he doesn't say you pick those up, take them in the town, and hand them out to the poor and needy. The poor and needy had to come out, and they had to gather it themselves, but it was there and available for them. And I'll get to that some more in just a moment. Verse 11. And by the way, a lot of these are you'll see are the Ten Commandments restated. Verse 11, do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Now let me read that verse again. Do not curse the deaf. Now why would they curse the deaf? Now they couldn't hear them. As if you hear the old man that he would wait till his wife turned off her hearing aid, and then he'd let her have it. Do not curse the deaf, but there's another reason. Why would they curse the deaf?
Later on, you see that they thought that was a sign of sin.
Okay, exactly. And because he mentions this in the context, in the same sentence, the deaf and one other disability, what is it? The blind. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. So these are prohibitions against people who have obvious physical disabilities. And even way back in Leviticus, because you remember the religious leaders went to Jesus, or it was the disciples said to Jesus when they saw someone who had a physical disability, and they said, who sinned, this person or their parents? And he said, neither one. Do you remember that discussion? And so apparently they didn't read Leviticus, because here God is clearly saying, don't give people a difficult time because they have a physical disability. Instead, he says, but for your God, I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do, well, there goes politics. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate your brother in your heart. And again, a discussion that Jesus had as well. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in his guilt. Don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. Do not make different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. If a man sleeps with a woman who is a slave girl promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death because she had not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance of the tent of meeting for a guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. When you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all of its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In this way, your harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Don't practice divination or sorcery. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Amen. Do not cut your bodies for the dead. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Now, I have no judgment about tattoos, and we've been free from the law, but I do find it fascinating that they had tattoos. I mean, I don't know how long tattoos have been around, but it's at least 3,000 years. It's a long time. Verse 29, do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute. That would definitely degrade her. Or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Again, I'm fascinated by the fact that they already had mediums and spiritists, because their theology about the spiritual world was very, very primitive, very basic, and yet they already had that, apparently. Verse 32, rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord. That may be the most overlooked verse in the Bible in the 21st century. Rise in the presence of the aged. That is, stand in reverence. Show respect for the elderly. Verse 33, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself. For you were aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do you remember that Jesus had a discussion, and I believe it may have been in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and what? Hate your enemy. Now, if you'll remember up in a previous verse where he tells them to love their neighbor, what verse was that? I just read it. Verse 17 says, do not hate your brother. And then verse what? 34? This has to do with strangers. But in a previous verse, he says, love your brother or love your neighbor. I think he says, love your neighbor. But here he says, concerning those who are not your neighbor, that is, the Jews considered their neighbors to be who? Fellow Jews. Now he's talking about people who are not your fellow Jews, these that are not native born. He says, love him as yourself, or love them as yourself, for you are aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So if you're to love your neighbor, your fellow Jews, and you're to love people that are aliens, who's left? That's everybody. You're supposed to love everybody. And this is way back in Leviticus. But they misinterpreted this and had warped it by the time Christ came along, where they basically had rewritten it in their minds and in their hearts to say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But it never says that in this passage. They just made that up. It says love your neighbor, but it doesn't say hate your enemy. It says love foreigners as well. Verse 35, do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. That is, have good business ethics. Verse 36, use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. Now, here's why I wanted to share this chapter with you, because in it, he discusses, as you see, a whole variety of things. And God is thorough with his people about how you behave in society. But you'll notice in these laws, it has to do with how you treat other people. Personally, professionally. Whether you're a neighbor or whether aliens or whether you're making a business deal or they're a relative or whoever they may be. This is how you have a relationship with others. This is how you get along. And that's what God is trying to say. So again, this writer says these are precepts relating to other people. These begin with respect for one's parents in chapter 19, verse 3, which is the fifth commandment. Related to this is respect for the aged in verse 32, for God is concerned about the elderly. And there are many other passages that talk about that as well. And we should be concerned or respectful too. God is also concerned for those with physical handicaps, as in verse 14. Jesus healed the blind and the deaf. We can't do that, but we can help protect them and enable them to live better lives. God is also concerned for strangers in our midst, in verse 33, and he often reminded the Jews that they have been strangers in Egypt. He does that in our passage tonight, but he had done it multiple times before. When you consider the thousands of foreign students who attend our colleges and universities alone in the United States, a mission field at our doorstep, this admonition becomes even more significant. One of the more public parts of our news media lately has been bias or bigotry toward Asians. And the theory or the claim is that there's bias and bigotry toward Asians now, as opposed to 5 years ago, because of what? COVID. It came from China, and we're dumb Americans. We can't tell the difference between a Chinese and a Filipino, apparently, so we just hate them all, which is just so silly. And so we're having that issue here, but apparently we shouldn't if we paid any attention to God's word, because he clearly tells us how we are supposed to behave concerning those outside of our country, to be kind and hospitable to them. God's concern for the poor and needy is seen in the harvest laws. That's what they called them, that we read also. It is also seen in the regulation about wages in verse 13. Since workers were paid daily, any delay would cause hardship. And so he said, at the end of the day, you pay them, if you remember that verse. And employers must never take advantage of their employees. Rich and poor stand equal before God and the law, and justice must not be partial, because God hears the cries of the poor when they are oppressed. The nation must be careful to have just weights and measures, that is, to have fair and ethical business practices, lest unscrupulous merchants rob innocent people, which of course happens all the time. So that is, now of course I could spend a tremendous amount of time on that chapter just because he talks about so many different things. But I appreciate how he does that, how he just brings in so many things, but they're all connected in how we treat other people. Any comments about this chapter? Yes?
I don't know if it can be explained, but Pharisees and Sadducees study the law.
Yes,
This is specifically the law.
Yes.
In this chapter, there's 4 or 5 instances that are specifically addressed by Christ that were in this chapter.
Yes,
How do they get to the point where they're studying the law? I remember they had to memorize the first 5 books at some point, maybe not. But how do you get to the point where you have to memorize this stuff, but then gloss over so many glaring things that Christ shows up 2,000 years later and says, you read this wrong, you read this wrong, you read this wrong.
It's a very good question, and for those who are watching online, because I can't hear you, I'll restate your question or your statement. He says, how can, because the Pharisees, the religious leaders in the day of Jesus, they knew the law, they were experts in the law, they knew Leviticus, and probably had Leviticus memorized, by the way. They knew the Pentateuch. The Leviticus is part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and that was their Bible of the day. And so they knew it well. They based everything off of these laws. And so if they had these laws, knew these laws, how could they get it so wrong? Because Jesus time and again had to say, no, you got this wrong, you got this wrong, you got this wrong. You've forgotten this verse, you're not obeying that verse. How could they be that far off? And here's it's a very important question, because we have the same challenge today. We have so many people and believers in Christ who we know what to do. We've read the Bible. How many sermons have you heard? How many Sunday school lessons? How many devotional guides have you read? How many vacation Bible schools did you go to, or camps did you go to when you were young? How many Wednesday night services? How many books do we have in our bookstores? How many resources do we have available? You can go to YouTube and look at literally tens of thousands of videos from theologians and scholars and Sunday school teachers, and you can just study all you want. You can type in this passage, for example. You can type in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. Just one verse, any verse in the Bible, type that into Google, and you can pick up literally tens of thousands, if not millions, of hits of articles, discussions, and lessons about that one verse, any one verse. In light of this unprecedented resource that we have in our world, or resources that we have, we should all be theologians, and frankly, we know what's right and what's wrong. Most of us know what to do. You have studied enough Bible. You don't have to be a theologian to get the basic precepts of the New Testament. And yet, I assure you, if Jesus walked in tonight, he might say those very words. How could you guys get it so wrong? Because we go out and we immediately go from loving to hateful. We were in a restaurant this week. I was there with my wife because we had a gift card. And it was an old gift card from Christmas that we hadn't used, and so this diet thing started tonight that we do here at the church twice a year, The Biggest Loser, and so we wanted to exhaust all of our gift cards before the diet started. So it was to a Mexican food restaurant, which is even better, and so we were there, and so we go in, and it's at about 15% capacity, maybe 20% at the most. We went there about 1:30, or 2 o'clock after the lunch hour, and so most of the tables were all clean and they were all empty. The place was, I won't say deserted, but there just weren't hardly anybody there. So we waited about 5, 7, 8 minutes before anybody even came up. There was not a waiter or waitress anywhere on the floor. There was nobody. Just a few people in there eating, and finally somebody comes out. So at this point, the love of Jesus was drifting away. And then she says, well, we don't have any tables available. And there are no COVID restrictions or anything in there. And she and I, Terry and I both scanned the restaurant once again, in stunned response to her statement. Not only were there tables available, almost every table was available. And I said, what? Because she said, there's no table available. And I said, there's tables everywhere. And she said, well, okay, we're short-staffed, and just turned around and walked off. So what little Jesus there was left in me drained out at that very moment. It doesn't take a lot for us to lose our religion. I've been studying my whole life. I have multiple degrees in theology. That didn't make any difference when I was on the border. My degrees didn't help me one bit. And so we struggle as well. I understand the Pharisees, but I can tell you this, because Jesus dealt with the heart of the problem when he called them whitewashed tombs, that they were pretty on the outside, but they were empty, dark, and corrupt on the inside. The problem with the Pharisees wasn't their lack of knowledge. It was their corrupt heart. It was their own evil wickedness that drove them. This Sunday, I'm going to look at the Passion Week from the perspective of Judas. And we're going to see that very same thing. How can anybody spend that time with Jesus and have come to that conclusion that he did? Well, it's all heart. It's a heart matter. Same conclusion that billions of people come to in our world. It is what it is. So there's a free commercial for you. But to answer your question, I'm sure Jesus was not surprised. He couldn't be surprised, but I know he was astonished and saddened when he encountered that kind of expertise on the outside, but emptiness and evil on the inside. When you're not right in here, anything you read from God's word is just going to go in one ear and out the other. And that's what we have in our world today. Yeah. All right, thank you for that question. Well, let's end our Bible study there for tonight. Thank you for joining with us online or in person. And now we're going to look at our prayer list for the week. If you would just...